Welcome to Management Development Man. Today is the first day of our second week. We'll be focusing predominantly on strategy. We're so pleased to have Robert Ahomka-Lindsay as our guest. Robert is an amazing guy who's been trained in Chicago Business School, worked with Coca-Cola for many years, came back to Ghana to do lots of businesses, including being a board member of Car Bank at some point, worked with Lindsay Capital, which he founded, also did public work, he did public sector, GIPC chief executive for a few years as well. So he brings a lot of experience to the discussion on strategy. He's our guest. You can send your questions to us or to him on 0549986996. We want to start with the basics of strategy. What is strategy formulation? How do you go about it? And how do you implement or act upon what you have formulated? Robert is our guest in the studio, but this program is brought to you by the Student Loan Trust Fund. If you need help with funding tertiary education, contact the Student Loan Trust Fund. We've taken over from SNIT the responsibility of administrating students' loans in Ghana. So contact us for your loans today. Log on to sltf.gov.gh or call 0302-231-886. It's also brought to you by Zenith Bank. Be spotted using your Zenith card at any of our ATMs and 140 points of sale terminals. Use your Zenith card for safe, secure, and convenient transactions and feel the buzz. Enhance your business productivity with total communication solutions from Airtel Business. It doesn't matter whether you're an SME, a large corporate, or multinational organization, there's a service made just to suit your communication needs. Airtel Business offers service to enhance your business communication and connectivity with fixed voice, mobile data, lease lines, IPLC, dedicated internet, satellite communications, managed and hosted services. Dial 456 from your Airtel line or 026 0000456 or email ebusiness@gh.airtel.com. Talk to Airtel Business today and enhance your business productivity. Well, let's go straight into the program. Mr. Ahomka-Lindsay, such a pleasure having you. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to you and all your team and your good listeners. Good to be back at City FM.
Great to have you. What have you been up to? I mean, you've been into all kinds of things. You've done public and private sector, done all kinds of things. So these days, what do you do?
Well, as you said in your introduction, Lindsay Capital is the company I'm involved in. I'm still involved in elements of the private and public sectors. I have some business interest. I recently came back, for instance, from Barbados, where we're working with the Ministry of Trade Industry there on some of the developments of youth development and SMEs. So it's been an interesting time.
Amazing. Strategy. When I called you on strategy, you were very, very prompt to say yes, you would do it. It seems to me as if for you, strategy, you are big on strategy.
Oh, it is critical. They say if you don't plan, you plan to fail. It's that simple. And strategy is a critical element of everything, not just business, government, and even personal life. Strategy is a part of it. And so I was very keen when you made that suggestion as to look at strategy, formulation, and implementation.
And can I say strategy was important even in the public sector?
Without a doubt. It doesn't matter what entity or what vehicle or what mechanism you're involved in. Strategy is critical. From public, private, personal, corporate versus other institutions, NGOs, it's all about strategy. Strategy, simply put, is deciding how you want to do things. So it is important you have an understanding of that in everything you do.
So let's go straight to your presentation. What are you going to talk about?
Well, for the next 20 or so minutes, I want to talk about how strategy is formulated or developed. And I'm going to use my work from a paper written by Mr. Christensen and Donovan, which I found to be the most relevant given our sort of current economic situation. And I'm going to talk about how strategy is formulated, what are the key factors that help that formulation. I will talk about how it's implemented, the pluses and minuses in implementation. And then I'm going to add a little bit about monitoring, which wasn't included, but I think is critical, because at the end of the day, whatever you've created, if you don't monitor and take the lessons from it, you might as well not have started in the first place. Let me start off, if I may. So if you think normally about how most company strategies come to be defined, it is not what you'd expect. Your expectation is that people would sit down, have these wonderful plans, and then they implement them, and then, hey, presto, they become the biggest company, the best performing government, the best person, etc. However, organizations who have had their strategies propel them to the top of their industries not have arrived at those strategies, normally through trial, error, and unanticipated success. Rarely was the winning strategy clear to the combatants at the outset. So rarely were you at the beginning not knowledgeable, because nobody can predict the future. So what you find is that as organizations dive deeper into the undefined waters of new economies, and as traditional business models are being turned inside out, it is crucial that leaders of established and startup companies alike understand the processes by which strategies are shaped in order to guide them as they move forward. The purpose of this discussion, I'm going to say, is to provide a fairly simple, but I think an in-depth way of looking at how strategy is defined and is implemented. Understanding the key dimensions of this process can help executives or managers keep their hands more precisely on those levers that control how strategy gets defined and implemented, and to adjust the workings of that process as the competitive environment changes, which it surely would do. So let's start first with the strategy formulation. In every entity, as I said, there are two independent and simultaneous processes through which strategy comes to be defined. The first strategy-making process is conscious and analytical, involving assessments of market structure, competitive strengths and weaknesses, the nature of the customer's needs, or the customer is defined in a wider sense, and the drivers of that market's growth. Strategy in this process is typically formulated in a project with a discrete beginning and an end. Top-tier management consultants often manage these projects. The result of this process is called intended or deliberate strategy. So point one, intended or deliberate strategy. Intended strategies can be implemented as they have been envisaged in if three conditions are met, and it's very important. So let me put intended deliberate strategy can it be implemented if these three conditions are met. First, in the organization, they must understand each important detail of management intended strategy. So the organization must understand what it is they want to do. Second, if the organization is to take collective action, the strategy needs to make as much sense to each of the members in the organization as they view it from their own context, as it does to the top management. So at every level of the organization, it must make sense to them in their context. And finally, the collective intentions must be realized with little unanticipated influence from outside political, technological, or market forces. So those forces should not affect the intended strategy. Now, we all know that it is difficult to find a situation anywhere in the world where all these conditions are met. So it is rare that an intended strategy can be implemented without significant alteration, because there is outside political influence, there are technological influence, and market forces at play. So that's one, the intended or deliberate strategy. The second strategy making process has been termed the emergent strategy. Emergent as in emerging markets. It is the cumulative effect of the day-to-day prioritization decisions taken or made by middle managers, engineers, salespeople, financial staffs, permanent secretaries, people's secretaries, etc. Decisions that are made despite or in the absence of intentions, i.e. the intended strategy. In fact, managers typically do not frame these decisions as strategy at all. The decision to accept and make things are done based on the interpretation of what's there. An example, Sam Walton's decision to build his second store in another small town near his first one, Arkansas, rather than a large city, led to Walmart's discovery of the attractive economics of building preemptively large stores in small towns. Emergent strategies result from managers' daily responses to problems or opportunities that were unforeseen by those engaged in the deliberate strategy-making process at the time they were doing their analysis and planning. So it's post that section. So that it talks about how the two elements form strategic formulation, intended and emergent. Let's now talk a little bit about how those are then affected through an organization. So regardless, though, of where your strategy starts from, any strategy must flow through a common filter, what we call the resource allocation process. This is because the company's actual strategy is manifested only through the stream of new products, processes, services, and acquisitions to which resources are actually allocated, not hoped, but actually allocated. The resource allocation process acts like a filter that determines which intended or emergent initiative actually gets funding and passes through, and which proposals are denied resources. So it's between emergent, intended, resource allocation that leads to actual. And the resource allocation filter is what will drive that base. Now, let's talk about that a little bit. The resource allocation is a complex, diffuse process that occurs at every level, every day, and in all entities. So, for example, a saleswoman must decide which customer to call on today and which customer she will not visit. When meeting with a customer, she must decide which products to emphasize in the conversation and which to ignore. Every day that an engineer who is a member of a multiple product development teams comes to work, he or she must need to decide which of these projects to work on that day and which to put on the back burner. If the criteria that guide prioritization decision is thus diffused through resource allocation, and that is not carefully tied to the company's intended strategy, which unfortunately often they're not, significant disparities can develop between a company's intended strategy and its actual strategy. And again, I stress, I use the word company in a wider sense. It could be in any entity. So if your criteria for resource allocation, diffusion, or decision making is not tied to the company's your intended strategy, you end up with two different, to the left pulling to the left and the right pulling to the right. Understanding and controlling the criteria by which day-to-day resource allocation decisions are made at all levels of the organization, therefore, is key. It's a key challenge in managing the process of defining and implementing a strategy. Let's talk a little bit about those areas. Initiatives that receive funding or other resources from resource allocations processes can be called strategic actions as opposed to strategic intentions. Secondly, strategic actions, on the other hand, have real impact. So to understand companies' actual strategies, pay attention to what they do rather to what they say. To understand anybody's strategy, pay attention to what they do versus what they say. It goes back to saying actions speak louder than words, but that's the fundamental fact. Let me just put that into a manner that maybe help us all. So you've got, on one hand, intended strategy on the top, and then you've got the emergent strategy, which comes to the bottom of the organization often. Then in the middle, you have the resource allocation process, which sort of filters it. And as a result of that filter, you get strategic actions, new products, services, processes, acquisitions, which leads to an actual strategy. That actual strategy then feeds back into improved understanding of what works and doesn't work with the intended strategy. Here's where normally you have those wonderful management consultants being paid the big bucks getting involved. And then it feeds on the other side back to the emergent strategy through the unanticipated opportunities, problems, and successes. So you have literally a virtual circle where in a live and dynamic environment that should keep going. So there we've talked about the two areas.
Emergent and deliberate strategy.
And emergent delivery. Now let's talk about the development process and the implementation process. In one of the Harvard Business Schools and reports, one of the things they noted was that the vast majority of ideas for developing new products, services, and processes bubble up from employees within the organization. I repeat, the vast majority of ideas for new developing products, services, and processes bubble up from employees within the organization. Middle management cannot carry all these ideas up to senior management for approval and funding. However, they must decide which ideas they should take up and they will throw their weight behind, and which they will allow just to simply fall away. Middle management's decision, therefore, plays a crucial role in resource allocation processes. If senior managers want to control the process by which strategy is defined and implemented, they must understand and shape the criteria that middle managers and those below them are using to make prioritization decisions. This becomes critical. That's something sometimes we forget. And what it basically means, if you want to put it in balance, is that the top doesn't always have the answer. It is not necessarily the people at the top organization, but we've seen empirical evidence shows the vast majority of new ideas come to those people who are the cold face, and we shouldn't be surprised. They deal with the customer every day. They're out there trying to make your strategies that you've sat in this wonderful Eiffel Tower and retreat and made this strategy, and then they'll come and tell you, sorry, so it doesn't work. But if you don't allow that to bubble up, you end up having a top going its own way, the ivory towers, as they say, sitting there among the clouds, and then the poor folks at the bottom who are trying to make it work doesn't work. Let me now go to the fourth area, which is the question of organizational context and how that affects strategy. Now, organizational context has many dimensions. However, three of them are particularly powerful filter mechanism in almost every organization's resource allocation process. The first is the structure of the company's income statement. Let me explain that. This determines the gross profit margins that the company must earn to cover overheads and earn a profit. Most managers have a very difficult time to prioritize resource allocation process initiatives and proposals that will not maintain or improve the organization's profit margin, especially if that margin leads to their bonuses. So the effect that such a filter mechanism will have on a company's strategic possibility can be profound. A second important element is that the short tenure in a given job that is typical in the career path of high-powerful, high-potential employees. Management development systems in most organizations move high-potential employees into new positions of responsibilities every 2 or 3 years or so in order to help them master management skills in various parts of the business. The effect of this practice, however, is to limit the payback time on investment proposals that most managers can enthusiastically endorse. Aspiring managers will instinctively accord priority to effort that will pay off within the typical tenure in their job, short, in order to produce the improved results required to earn attractive information. This short-sighted investment horizons of result-oriented managers are typically attributed, for instance, to Wall Street's demand for near-term profit improvement, are in fact deeply embedded in the management development process. We can use the same thing in the public service. Let me talk a little bit more then about the contextual aspect of the organization. So within the organization, we've talked a little bit about intended strategy, the resource allocation, and the emergent strategy, and how that leads through the strategic resource processes. Then there are two areas I want to talk about, the organizational context and the structural context. So within organizational context, make sure that the strategy which you've agreed on, the actual strategy, is vested in. Organizationally, it has to be acceptable margins that are allowed by cost structure. So does it meet the P&L requirement? Does it meet my requirements from a working perspective? The tenure in job and management development process is crucial, because we've talked about the fact that it is those middles, the senior managers, that allow that filtering process. But if I'm there very short period, and I'm only there for 24 months, then I'll only take those decisions of those initiatives that help me meet my objective in 24 months. And then the career impact of project failure, i.e., how does the organization react to failure? Is this an organization that encourages people to experiment? Because if the answer is no, then all you get from senior managers is everything they feel to be safe, in inverted commas. And then the standard planning processes you put in place. Are you allowing the bubble process to come up? Do you have structures in place in the organization that allows that? And I go back to say again, because the vast majority, this is a proven fact, can be argued with, of successful businesses have found their innovation that came through the bottom. So if you don't have the structures to do that, then basically what you are saying is you are limiting your ability to grow, because your largest potential source of new ideas, product and development has been cut off. Then there's the structural context of that. I'm sorry, I'm going through a lot of detail, but I think it's important for us to understand these. The structure of the organization is important. So if the structural organization of the company talks about boosting stock price by accelerating growth rate, then it will lead to certain decision. If all you are interested in is make sure that you have high stock market price, then you are going to make decision. If you're interested to make sure you are there 3 years time to make a decision on an election, that is going to make a decision. If you're interested to make sure in 4 years time you're going to get married and you need family, therefore you need to do X, Y, and Z, that will make a decision. So your need to boost whatever is structurally embedded in your decision-making process of your organization will filter decisions, opportunities to meet that. It's almost like if you're hurting yourself with your own, you are limiting your ability. Secondly, the customer's demands. Now, your customer will continually make demands, which is right. The customer can be an electorate, it can be a business, it can be your kids in making strategic decisions. If those demands will filter decisions, so if you're in a situation where customers continue demanding for X, you will filter those opportunities to meet that demand at the expense of others because of that. And the same thing is competitors' action. When you're in an environment where the competitor is pushing a lot of the access, you will get involved in that as well. Now, I'm going to, because of timing, and I know you gave me 20 minutes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about implementation, which is critical in what we do.
Very important, implementation.
One of the things that most business school models or any other model talks about, implementation is a factor of 3 key areas. 1, your strategy. 2, it's planned, and I put that word very clearly, planned execution. We call implementation quite a weird ways, but planned execution says you start on Monday with 1, and by Friday you're on 6. Not I write it and I shelve it and I have a nice opening and forget about it. And then thirdly, the monitoring. So let me talk about the strategic purse, which we've talked about, which is what is the content of that strategy and how important it is that we involve the processes of both your resource allocation and your infrastructure. By definition, it says that if part of your objective is not appropriately within your resource allocation decision or your infrastructure, your company structure, you have to change. So if you're trying to get something else out of that organization, and that organization's resource allocation process or structure does not meet that, you are not going to get to where you are. That is why you find often within the private sector, somebody will come in and they will suddenly take over a company, and within a short period of time, this company is doing so much better. Why? Because they've changed those 2 key areas, how you make resource allocation in the company structure. So in terms of that first point, that's clear. Now let's talk about the execution plan strategy. You need to make sure everything in your organization is structured towards the implementation of that. Your hiring system, your reward system, your penalty system, your bonus system, your very existence is based on that. And it means that your managers, from the senior, from the board to the senior, etc., have to continually ask you, give me an update on the implementation. Your structures of key business indicators, which tells you how you're performing, and key business indicators not linked to just business, has to reflect that implementation. So it must say, if your objective is to get to so much market share, you must make sure every quarter, month, semi-annual, whatever it is, you have the appropriate processes of getting a report. And if you don't get it, you ask the question. Because if you don't ask the question, people would go back to the comfort zone. The comfort zone is do the same thing we've been doing over the past 25 years. And frankly, you become extinct, like the dinosaurs. And that's the fact of reality. So it's important you have a planned, executable, step-by-step process with regular interventions and regular feedback. On that point of intervention, that is where then you have the monitoring. So you planned on doing X, but you tend to find you started on Monday and your exchange rate was 2, and by the next month your exchange rate is 3. What are you going to do? You can't just sit there and say, well, okay, I'm still going to keep with the plan. The monitoring will give you an ability to go and reassess where you started and ensure that you now have strategy make the sense. So if your assumptions of cost of production were based on 2 and you are on 3, and you continue to make decisions based on 2, you are going to fail because a key component is not working. If what you find is that the emergent strategy, your whole structure, is resistant to that change, there must be a reason. So the monitoring will pick that out, and the monitoring will allow you then to go back and review what decisions you make with the viewpoint of trying to affect then the strategy to an actual strategy. So it's a cyclical process, and it is absolutely critical. I actually believe that there's no point in having a strategy you're not going to monitor it, because the monitoring will give you a checks and balances and ability to go through. You execute, you monitor. If you monitor, you will see if you're not executing. And if you monitor, you see whether your original strategy even made sense. And so it is critical in anything you do. And that is why if you find a number of our key, and business, there's a reason why often people use business. But it is the same with the public sector. The most successful entities that you will find are those that have those clear areas linked, particularly the monitoring. If you go at the beginning of your financial year to your board and tell them, I want so much capital to do X, to get this market share, to get this growth in my structure, let me assure you, if by the end of that year you have not delivered it, you will not get the capital for the next following year. And you won't get the capital if you wait till the end of the year to come and tell the manager, sorry, it didn't happen because X, Y. The first question I would ask you when I was chair of Cal Bank would have been, excuse me, what were you doing for the 12 months? Were you not monitoring the process? Were you not monitoring to make sure you put corrective measures in place? So it is absolutely critical that you have those three in engagement. Bernard, there's a lot more I could have gone through, but in the 20 minutes, I just want to capture these areas.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Robert. So there you have it, strategy, formulation, and implementation on the Management Development Month. I guess Robert Ahomka-Lindsay segment brought to you by the Student Loan Trust Fund, Zenith Bank, and Airtel Business. All right, I'm going to ask you to break down some of the things you said. For example, you differentiated deliberate or intended strategy from emergent or unintended strategy. And then you said that somehow the two interplay, or typically or ideally the two should interplay to create your actual strategy. But in practice, what really happens? You've spoken about the ideal and what should happen. But here I am at CTFM trying to formulate a strategy to compete maybe for the next 3 years. From experience, what typically tends to happen? Not what should happen. Tell us what tends to happen. Is strategy more emergent or more deliberate generally?
The reality is strategy is more emergent. This is what the fact shows, that in reality the most successful entities across all spectrum are those which have been more emergent. The skill set is to make sure the emergent is linked step by step with the intended. Now that is the skill set. So that, and remember how the emergent comes about. The emergent comes about, frankly, through the bubble up effect. So a good business process and strategy formulation will try and make sure, why do you have retreats? Why do you have staff feedback? These were set up for a reason. Unfortunately, we haven't taken it through the whole process. So at CTFM, you should spend more time speaking to your people on the ground here and have structures in place that encourages upstreaming of ideas. Take those ideas and put it into a structured format so that your resource allocation processes are then based on that. Because you need both. The reality is you need both. So if you just go fully on the intended, then you end up missing. The reality is that you may be taking only,
Because I was going to say that if emergent appears to be the dominant way strategy eventually pans out, why even plan to strategize?
Because you need to make sure the emergent, by the definition, comes from a wide base, and you can't make decisions based on 65 different options. You need to bring that to 3, but you need to decide from the 65 how to get to 3, and you take then the 3 to feed the intended, and then it's almost a reciprocal process. The intended then will then be cross-checked by the emergent. So you still need a strategic process, because resource allocation can't be based on 65. It must be based on 3.
Again, on the issue of bubble effect that you speak about, I get the impression, or I had the impression initially, that strategy is such an important concept, and it should be left to high-level thinkers at the top of a bank or of a business. You're suggesting that the best strategy comes from ordinary people who work in a company, who may not have all the information that the managers or the high-level what they call SMT, strategic management team, has. This goes against the grain of what a lot of people see as where strategy formulation lies.
Oh yes, I agree, and that's one of the reasons why I brought that paper forward, because the reality is we sometimes believe that the top is an all-knowing, all-understanding, all-funded entity. That's not the facts don't support that. The simple facts do not support
all
that.
industries.
All industries. Do a check.
So if we want to formulate strategy at CTFM,
yes,
we should speak to the security man, speak to the broadcast journalist, and speak to the ordinary sales executive who is going to meet clients.
Yes, because
the feedback they bring is what to help us
critical
formulate the strategy.
But it should be, actually, if you think about it, it's actually self-evident, because they are close to your customers and they know more about just going on a petition at the level of ground than a management consultant. A management consultant has a role because he or she needs to take all of that and put it into a structure. As you said, the security guards focus on security, salesperson on sales, the accountant on accountant, etc. So you need to be able to put all of that within a strategic management decision that takes
But
care
do
of
these
results.
people understand the complexities of the market? Do they know what our competitor is doing? I mean, do they know the political pressures you're facing at the top?
Let me tell you, yes or no. First of all, the security person doesn't need to understand the complexity. The salesperson's job is to sell or take care of security. Secondly, the yes then becomes yes to do, because your salesperson that is out there in the marketplace trying to get you revenue knows better. Because every day when he or she goes to a customer, they'll be told, oh, X company just left me. They offered me X. Now, how long is that going to take, that X, to bubble through the system of reports and so forth? But if you are able to get that feedback straight away, that is when that feeds in to create the actual strategy. And it affects the intended. So you have hopefully made your intended strategy by listening to your team. But things are changing. The dynamic strategy is never static. It is dynamic. So you need to make sure that comes in. So maybe you assumed that your competitor will follow your price action. But when you went down to the market, you actually found that, hold on a minute, they actually went the opposite. Now, you're not going to wait for the management consultants to come back and tell you that. No, you need to be able to get that in now.
So the raw material for strategy formulation is with the foot soldiers.
Without a doubt.
That's the raw material.
Without a doubt.
But the responsibility for formulating a strategy still lies with those at the top.
They do, but you got to make sure that it is collaborative.
Okay.
Because they have to bring it into a structure. Because as we were saying earlier, the person that is focused with sales, marketing, finance, by definition is focused on that. But the combined input of all of the knowledge base is what gives your competitive edge.
So how do you create a system that benefits from ideas from bottom up?
You know, let me look at an example. You've heard of companies like Google that don't have structures. People all sit around the same table. Don't create. I sometimes go to offices and I see these wonderful big walls. The managers sit on a different level. There's even a special lift for those managers.
The managers on the last floor, executive floor.
Executive floor, nobody goes there. It is only, and the poor foot soldiers are sitting a different level. Those kind of organization will die. An organization that encourages through specific actions like retreats, focus groups, idea sharing is the one that bases. If I look at my old company, Coca-Cola, where we got involved in, we had so many executable retreats and focus because we realized that at the end of the day, it is the man or woman on the corner where you take a left of your main road that is selling, that knows how well this product is doing on the marketplace. But he or she is put into one context. We need to take all that in, structure it, and feedback. So organizations that do that, you will find even things like suits. You find some organizations break down this barrier of clothing etiquette, because you always find those that are the executive are the ones wearing the Giorgio Armanis, and those are others are wearing whatever they can afford. So you have organizations, people don't even believe in corporate clothing. There's intermingling. Organizations that do that, and it should be self-evident. They always say 2 heads are better than 1. Well, how about how many people in the city of Him? How many people do you have working at any time in total? 50, 60 people?
Here at City?
Yes.
Probably 75 or
Okay.
80.
I would say 75 is better than the 5 or 6 sitting at the top. And if you can harness the power and knowledge of that 75, you'll be onto a good thing.
This is Management Development Month. We're talking to Robert Ahomka-Lindsay on strategy formulation and implementation. And he's given us some very interesting thoughts on the subject. He's left us off at implementation and monitoring, which is key in his view. A few questions coming through. If you have a question, send us a text on 054-998-6996. We'll be happy to read those comments. We're also on Twitter at CT973 or at my Twitter handle Benkoku or Kujo Akotoboatin's Twitter handle, which I can really not remember. Why do you always use what kind of Twitter handle is that?
It's just simple. African Mogul.
African Mogul. Now, I get the sense that a lot of organizations, especially the financial services, even though they claim they have long-term ambitions, they evaluate their management team by short-term goals. So, for example, the bonus culture. Every bank will do annual review or quarterly review and see how well you're doing and reward you for how you've done within a quarter or maximum a year. Yet these same people say they have a long-term orientation. Is there not a contradiction there between what long-term strategy is and the reward systems we put in place, which seem to be focused on short-term. I mean, you can even bring that into sales in companies.
Oh, there is no doubt about it. If you create a reward system, as I was saying, if that rewards instant decision making or instant upside, you are going to end up with decisions that focus. So let me give an example. If all you are going to base your sales force on is how much money they bring in tomorrow, they will do everything to bring the money tomorrow. The fact that 3 weeks later they will all cancel becomes irrelevant. So a properly structured reward system which balances. So let's give, for example, in most organizations, senior managers are not rewarded or shouldn't be rewarded solely on short-term impact. Why? Because their decision by necessity are strategic. So they are based on managing people and managing the medium to long term. So you will find, for instance, that part of their reward system, if for instance the listed company, is based on the 3-year performance of the share price, or the 5-year performance, or your reward doesn't kick in until the share price hits a certain level. This has been a factor that people have been arguing about many times. Now, as you go down the organization structure, you still need to have a system that rewards people for bringing the sales team, for bringing the business today. But you add on another aspect that says, yes, you will get, let's say, 50% of your bonus is based on what you've written for the past 12 months or 6 months or 3 months. But maybe another 50% will be based on your retention over the next further 6 months. So you have structures that indicate certain behaviors. And that is why the organizational structure becomes very important. If your objective is to grow a business quickly, look, some of the biggest spectacular failures in this world were based on just the need to quickly make a return for people, and people's behavior are completely rational. If you tell me you're going to give me a big bonus at the end of the year if I bring in X, I'm going to do everything I can. But if you tell me that X will have to survive over the next 3 years, that also changes my behavior. People are rational decision makers. So it's important that when an organization is looking at its reward structure, again, it links back to your strategy. If your reward structure is directly opposed to each other, you're going to end up with different activities.
Should we not differentiate the types of organization we're looking at in deciding which is more appropriate? You gave the Google example, and you said organizations that create walls and have this regimented difference between people may die. But you have to agree that there are some organizations that are innovation-led, talent-oriented organizations like media, broadcasting, technology, versus organizations like banks, where there is a proven long-term method of things working. Should we not differentiate the usefulness of emergent and deliberate on the basis of what type of industry you're in? Because you may be having what may work for Google or Apple may not work for a Bank of Ghana or a GIPC, because the two, what requirements you need to succeed in Bank of Ghana or GIPC is not the same as working in Google or Apple.
I would actually say the exact opposite. No, I think without the creativity, whether in your Google, Apple, Bank of Ghana, GIPC, you will die. Or banking sector. What is the banking? Think 5-10 years ago, what was the biggest bank in the world? Today, the largest financial institution is where was HSBC 10 years ago? Hong Kong Banking Corporation was a small organization out of Hong Kong. Today, it's a conglomerate. I remember when Midland Montague was the biggest by balance sheet. Today, it is a subsect of Royal Bank of Scotland, which nobody even think about. So, and what is that defines the difference between those organizations? Whether you're a bank, whether you are a Bank of Ghana, the only difference is when you're doing your analysis of organizational structure. For instance, I talked about what is the marginal expectations of the organization. So instead of having a growth profit expectation of 60%, maybe yours is to make sure that if I'm the Bank of Ghana, certain reserves are met. That's the only factor. It doesn't stop the fact that 5 brains are better than 1. And it doesn't still stop the difference between intended and emergent.
I was going to push you to give me an example, because you were in Coca-Cola.
Yes.
You did our bank, you did Lindsay Capital, but you did GIPC. And I dare say that what worked in Coca-Cola did not necessarily work at GIPC? Because the public sector, the way the organization works is slightly different.
So let me put another basis. Why is it that in so often across all over the world, people talk about bringing private sector disciplines into the public sector? Because the private sector has shown it works. That's a fact. It just means that we have a current culture that is not helping us. So you need to change it. So I'll give an example. You mentioned the example of GIPC. We had a situation where you had a situation where basically our organizational structure did not meet our intended strategy. So we had to make a change. And it was that simple. And let me tell you, I brought exactly the lessons that I learned from my private sector to the GIPC. What I had to do, though, this is what a good manager would have to do, is you have to base it on an understanding of the key drivers of that. So while in Coca-Cola it may be more volume and profit, in GIPC the result was more FDI, a better understanding doing business. And I think if you look at the result, you will see what happened between 2008 and the end of 2007, 2008. And so I would argue that actually sometimes when we seem to think that sometimes we work in a different environment to the rest of the world, but it's not true. Innovation, creativity, understanding your team, using your infrastructure, your people. Look, the minister or the head of the Bank of Ghana cannot run that organization by him or herself.
I agree. My only argument, if it's an argument at all, is that
no, it's just a good discussion.
The strategy formulation process involves certain processes which include feedback.
Yes.
And it's an ingredient of strategy formulation.
Yes.
But the responsibility of the document and the execution still rests with leadership.
And I am with you, but what I'm saying is the leadership that manages to link the emergent versus the intended will survive.
Fair point.
Okay,
here are some.
Aiken says, I want to know the difference between strategy and planning.
Okay.
Is there a difference between strategy and planning? Think about that.
Okay.
And this one says, I want to know if I can take a loan to buy a car for my business. I'm a phone card distributor.
Interesting question. Strategy as it pertains to a small business.
Okay.
And this one says, Bernard, you are focusing too much on big business. They can afford to pay these guys to come to them. Small businesses should be your focus. Creative solutions are what we need to start.
Are these things applicable to small business? I think that's the question. So 70% or more of Ghanaian businesses are in the informal sector. A large proportion are small and medium sized. Do these principles apply? That's Odil's question. And I answer the top two questions.
Okay, let me come to the question of strategy and planning. For my thinking, the way I try to look at the strategy talks in many aspects about aspiration. So where do I aspire to be? In 20, 30 years, I aspire to be X. Then my plan is how do I get there? What are the steps I need to take to go there? Sometimes these words are used interchangeably, but I use that as a basis of help me understand strategy. Where do I want to be? What do I see as my nirvana? And then planning is okay. It's a subject of implementation, if you will, and also monitoring, because then you say, okay, what are the steps I need to take to engage, to going through? And then there's question of by buying a loan for my phone card distributor. Well, part of what you need to ask yourself in making that decision is how much of that car is, how much of your success as distributor is dependent on that vehicle? That's the question. And then there's aspect of, does your business afford it? And will the increase in volume as a result of that lead with that? But you go through the same process. There is no difference in the process you go through. Will that extra expense lead to an increase in my turnover, profit level to include that? Or are you expected to be a phone distributor to be on one corner? If you are limited to your geographic nature of your distribution, i.e. they won't let you go there, then buying a car, I don't see how it's going to help you. But if you are able to take your distribution to a different level, then it can have an impact.
And then there was a final question about
SMEs. Now, it makes no difference. It actually makes no difference. I would actually argue a big business can afford to make more mistakes than a small business, because they can, as your caller says, was it Odile? They can afford to go and buy these wonderful management consultants who make a complete mess of things, but then the people on the ground get things done. As a small business, you are even more critical of your team. Why? Because you even have a smaller team. And you probably make up 40% of the team. So I would encourage you greatly as a small business to look at your emergent, your team on the ground. But remember that emergence still leads to strategy. It doesn't mean that you forget what the strategy is. All I'm trying to say is that understand what is on the ground. The emergent, by definition, says, I am close to the ground. I know what is happening today, not what was done in a survey 3 months ago. I know what is happening today, and I know what my intended actions are having. So I need to feed that back into my real action, my actual strategy.
Well, time was not on our side. We've been talking about strategy, how to formulate and implement strategy. And of course, our guest, Robert Ahomka-Lindsay, giving us some useful insights, differentiating emergent from deliberate strategy, giving us some factors that we should consider in the strategy development process, and how to also implement through execution and monitoring. It's been amazing, and this segment is